while he was governor of Ohio. I got my certificate in '37, and I went back to my hometown and taught the first grade at the school where I went to school, in my neighborhood.
And some of the teachers?
And some of the teachers that I had in those grades were still there when I went back to teach, and they were very pleased that I came back.
That's marvelous.
And then, while I was
now, these were neighborhood children, so you must have known their parents and their older brothers and sisters.
Oh, yes, I knew their parents.
And what did they call you?
They called me Miss Mary.
Miss Mary.
Yes.
Career as Miss Mary.
Yes. And then while I was there, first year that I taught at J.J. Burns School in Canton, Ohio.
Is it still there?
It's still there in my
that one hasn't been closed?
No, that one hasn't been closed.
Marvelous.
Then the first year that I taught, I started taking extension courses in Canton to go on and get a degree. And I took a course once a week while I was teaching. I taught there 4 years, and when I was married at the end of 4 years, I had to quit. You know, in those days, married teachers weren't allowed to teach unless they were widows or substitutes.
You weren't allowed to be married?
No, that's right. It was a kind of immoral thing to be married and be a teacher. Can you imagine that? Isn't that simply incredible?
What can I say? So you had to quit?
Yeah, I had to quit.
At most, you could be a substitute.
I could be a substitute, or I could be a widow.
Do you know of anybody who discovered after certain months of marriage that they were more interested in being
widows than teachers? Well, I don't know. Anyhow,
sounds like an additional incentive.
I was married and moved to Cleveland, so it didn't matter for me. You see,
you got out.
But had I stayed in Canton, I would have had to stop teaching.
It sounds to me like in the course of this hour we're going to be able to say something about what's happened to the role of women in America in the last few years.
Has happened, yeah.
Because in fact, let's think about it. That's perfect. Mary, you're my perfect guest, because here you are starting out in the middle of the Depression, 1935, yeah, and teaching for 4 years in the Depression.
Yes.
And then, of course, we have the war. It's 39
right,
that you moved to...
well, I started to teach in 37, and in 41,
oh, 41.
I moved to Cleveland.
That's right, of course. 2 years
yes,
of school, then 41. Yes. So the war's already about to happen.
Yes, and we were married because my husband got a 4F. We knew he didn't have to go to the Army, so we were married. And I moved to Cleveland, and he was a social worker in Cleveland, although he had been trained to be a high school English teacher.
There weren't jobs for
Oh, there weren't any jobs.
There weren't any jobs. It was Depression, so you did what you had,
yes,
what you could.
And Lynn became a social worker in Cleveland. And the following January, he got a job in a high school in Yellow Springs, Ohio. And so we moved to Yellow Springs, Ohio.
Now that's where Antioch College is.
Right. We lived right on the edge of the campus. It was a wonderful place to live. And our children were born while we lived in Yellow Springs. They were all born in Springfield, Ohio, which was 9 miles east of Yellow Springs, I believe, east.
So Lynn got a job, and then were you working during this period?
No, I didn't go to work until after well, I must tell you about the Army. Ah. He was supposed to be free of the Army. Mm-hmm. In 1944, he was called again to be drafted. At that time, he was working at Wright-Patterson Field. He had gotten a job in the summer working there, and they wanted him to come and stay. And he did. And he was in materials, I believe. He was buying guided missiles, and he didn't think of much future in that. Well, anyhow, he had to go to Cincinnati and have another exam for the draft, and he went, and they accepted him, and they said he was 1A. And he asked the doctor why he was 1A, because 4 years earlier he was 4F, because he had pierced eardrums from having had scarlet fever as a child. And the doctor said, those are all healed up, it's all scar tissued over. So they took him. And he went to the Army, and he was in the Army in the States a year. He went from basic to officer training, and then he went abroad. And at the time he went abroad, the war had just ended. But he was in the occupation forces in Graves registration.
Oh, Lord.
And he was there a year. And while he was there, I worked at a factory in Yellow Springs, Ohio, that made equipment for Bendix washers and later made equipment for the Army after the war, for the Defense Department.
My mother always had a Bendix washer.
Yes.
Undoubtedly, her washer was made while you were
Yes,
there, Mary.
made at Vernay Laboratories.
There you go. Now, what kind of money did a guy get paid in the Army during the Second World War? Was that a financial hardship? You know, many of the people watching this program aren't going to know about that, so we better go over that.
Well, we got along fine. We had 3 children, and we were getting I was getting $75 a month while Lynn was in the Army, and putting it in the bank, and I had a checkbook, and I used a checkbook to spend $75 a month. Can you believe that? Our rent was $35. The rent was under rent control.
Okay.
I had a 2-story house for which we were paying $35 a month rent. And we saved some money while Lynn was in the Army, and when he came out of the Army in 2 years, he went to graduate school at Ohio State, which was 10 years after he graduated from Ohio State. He went to graduate school, and I stayed in Yellow Springs that first year because there was no housing. GIs had just taken up all the housing there was. So my husband lived in a private home that had a couple of graduate students. And I stayed in Yellow Springs, and I worked at the Antioch Tea Room office.
Plus the children.
And I had the children in Antioch Nursery School.
Ah.
And in '49, we moved to Columbus because we found housing. We found a house that was owned by a history professor at Ohio State who was going to the University of Oregon in Eugene. And Lynn was to meet a real estate man in Columbus on a particular street, and he got to that street and he was waiting there on the corner for the real estate man. He was a little early, so he took a walk in the neighborhood, and he came to a house that said, "For sale by owner." And he knocked on the door, and the history professor appeared, and he said, yes, his house was for sale. And Lynn said, well, I'm interested in buying a house and bringing my family here from Yellow Springs. We have 3 children. And he said, we have a nice big house, and if you can't afford to buy it, we'll sell it on contract. And we bought it.
Never did meet the real estate agent.
Well, yes, he did. He met him, and he said, I think I found the house I want. But my parents loaned us the down payment, and we moved in a nice big house, which was very much like a house we lived in this town for many years. We bought that house at the rate of $65 a month. And in 2 years, we converted to a bank mortgage and paid off Mr. Pomeroy, from whom we bought the house. And we lived in that house for 5 years while Lynn got his master's and his PhD.
So you were there right at the time of the big boom. The GI Bill filled the universities, and Lynn got his chance to go back and do the PhD degree and then pursue the career that he had started out on but had been nipped at because of the Depression.
Yes.
So in fact, he was now going to be teaching at the college level, not at the high school level.
And you see, because he had some high school experience teaching English in Yellow Springs, Ohio. By the way, he taught all the English. He had 5 classes of English every day at Bryan High School in Yellow Springs, Ohio. Because he had some experience, the second year that the first year he didn't teach, he got his master's, but starting the second year, which was the year, first year toward the PhD, they gave him a TA, and he taught freshman rhetoric. I believe they called it comp at Ohio State. They called it rhetoric here.
Yes.
He taught comp, and then a couple of years he was made an instructor. He was a good teacher. They liked his work. They made him an instructor.
While he was still working on his own PhD.
He was an instructor until he finished and got his degree in '54.
And then you thought you'd come here.
Then we thought we'd come here, and we thought we were going to be rich because Father had a PhD.